The silence of the Vance Ranch in 1887 was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, settling over the clapboard house like a second layer of dust, muffling the clink of a fork against a plate and the groan of the porch swing in the wind. For Nathaniel Vance, the silence was his father's doing, a monument built to the memory of his mother. It had been 6 months since they had laid Martha Vance to rest on the low hill overlooking the creek, and in that time, the space she had occupied with laughter and humming and the scent of baking bread had been hollowed out and filled with a quiet so profound it felt like its own kind of screaming. Nathaniel was 20, with his mother's deep-set eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He moved through his days with a sense of grim duty, his grief a constant, heavy companion. The ranch, once a place of shared purpose, had become a sprawling expanse of chores that separated him and his father, Owen. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching in unison, yet they might as well have been on opposite sides of the continent. They were two solitary planets orbiting a dead star, their paths parallel but never touching. Owen's grief was a fortress of stone, its walls high and impenetrable. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional, concerning fence posts, water levels, or the price of feed. He never spoke her name. Nathaniel's own sorrow was a different beast, a restless, pacing thing that clawed at him in the quiet of his small room at night. He missed the easy comfort of his mother's presence, the way she could soften his father's hard edges with a touch or a word, the way she had filled their small home with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Now, the house was just a structure, cold and echoing. The routine was their only language, the pre-dawn coffee brewed in tense silence, the long hours spent under the vast, indifferent sky, the evening meal eaten with eyes fixed on their plates. It was a life of resignation, a slow bleeding out of hope. He was checking the north fence line, a lonely stretch of wire that snaked through a landscape of unforgiving rock and hardy scrub, when he first heard it. It was a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the ceaseless Wyoming wind, a thin, wavering cry that was not animal. He reined in his horse, a sturdy bay named Anchor, and listened. The wind howled, a thing grieving for itself, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, weaker this time, a thread of sound nearly broken by the distance. He nudged Anchor off the familiar trail, his brow furrowed with a caution born of solitude. The land here was treacherous, dropping away into sudden ravines and gullies carved by millennia of spring melts. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the broken terrain. It led him to the edge of a steep, shadowed cut in the earth, a place where the ground simply fell away into a clutter of sharp rocks and tangled, thorny brush. And there, at the bottom, he saw it. A horse, its coat the color of dried blood, lay on its side at an unnatural angle, its legs jutting stiffly into the air. Pinned beneath its heavy torso was a figure, a person. A cold knot tightened in Nathaniel's stomach. He dismounted, his movements swift and sure, and tethered Anchor to a stunted pine. He carefully picked his way down the treacherous slope, loose scree skittering under his boots. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a scene of grim finality. The horse was long dead, its eyes glassy and vacant. The person trapped beneath it was a woman, her face turned away from him, her dark hair fanned out against the dirt. A length of her buckskin dress was torn, and one arm was flung out, the fingers curled loosely in the dust. He saw no movement. He feared he was too late. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. A slight tremor ran through her body. A low moan escaped her lips. She was alive. He reached the bottom of the ravine and knelt beside her. He could see now that she was native, her features finely drawn and smeared with dirt, her skin the warm color of fired clay. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. He gently touched her free shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open. They were dark, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but for a moment they held a spark of fierce, wary intelligence. Her lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He saw the way she was wedged, her leg trapped beneath the crushing weight of the dead animal. Dehydration, he guessed, and injury. She could not have been here for less than a day, maybe more. The task ahead was monumental and gruesome. He had to move the horse. There was no other way. He surveyed the scene, his practical rancher's mind taking over, pushing aside the horror of the situation. He had his rope, his strength, and the leverage of the steep incline. It would have to be enough. "I'm going to get you out," he said, more to himself than to her. "Just hold on." He didn't know if she understood his words, but as he stood to retrieve his rope, her dark eyes followed him, a silent, desperate plea in their depths. The unspoken communication passed between them, a fragile bridge of shared humanity in that desolate place. He was her only hope, and she, in her silent suffering, was a sudden, terrible responsibility that had fallen on him from the empty sky. The work was brutal. Nathaniel secured his rope around the dead horse's neck, the stiff hide resisting him. He scrambled back up the incline, looped the other end around the base of the pine tree, and began the agonizing process of using his own body as a counterweight, straining to shift the immense, dead weight even a few inches. His muscles screamed in protest, sweat stinging his eyes and soaking the back of his shirt. He hauled, grunted, and swore under his breath, his boots slipping on the loose rock. The woman below watched, her face a mask of pain. Inch by agonizing inch, he moved the carcass. It was a slow, grim victory, measured in scraped knuckles and burning lungs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he had shifted it enough. The pressure was off her leg. He slid back down the slope, his heart pounding with exertion and a strange, nervous energy. Her leg was twisted at a bad angle, swollen and bruised, but he ran his hands over it gently and felt, to his immense relief, that the bone did not seem to be broken. Her shoulder, however, was clearly dislocated, the joint sitting high and awkward. She winced as his fingers brushed against it, a sharp hiss of breath escaping her chapped lips. "All right," he murmured, his voice softer now. "Let's get you out of this ravine." Getting her up the slope was a new ordeal. She was weak, barely able to stand, and leaned heavily against him. He half carried, half dragged her, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, her arm draped over his shoulders. She was surprisingly light, like a bird with hollow bones, yet her resilience was palpable. She fought to place her feet, her jaw set with a determination that he found himself admiring. Every step was a shared battle against gravity and exhaustion. When they finally reached the top, they both collapsed beside Anchor, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. He offered her his canteen, and she drank, slowly at first, then with a thirst so profound it was painful to watch. Water trickled from the corners of her mouth, tracing clean paths through the grime on her chin. He knew he had only one choice. The nearest town, Prescott, was a full day's ride, and she would never make it. His own ranch was hours away, but it was the only shelter within reach. The thought of his father's face when he arrived with her sent a chill of apprehension through him. Owen Vance was not a man who welcomed complications. And this woman, a stranger, an Indian, was the biggest complication Nathaniel could imagine. He helped her onto Anchor's back, her body slumping forward against the horse's neck. He mounted behind her, his arms encircling her to keep her steady. As they started the slow journey home, he felt the fragile warmth of her body against his chest, a small, living ember in the vast, cooling landscape. He was riding into a confrontation he did not want, bringing a disruption to the silent, grieving order of his world. But as he looked back at the dark scar of the ravine, he knew he could not have left her there. His mother, Martha, would not have. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt he was doing something that was wholly his own, a decision made not from duty or routine, but from a simple, unadorned sliver of conscience. The lights of the ranch house were a pair of lonely yellow eyes in the deep velvet of the night when they finally arrived. Every bone in Nathaniel's body ached, and the woman, whose name he still did not know, had lapsed into a semi-conscious state, her head resting against his shoulder. As he dismounted and gently lowered her to the ground, the front door creaked open. Owen stood silhouetted in the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure whose shadow stretched long and accusingly across the dusty yard. "What have you done?" Owen's voice was low and flat, stripped of all emotion save for a weary disapproval. It was not a question so much as a judgment. "Found her in the North Ravine, pinned under her horse," Nathaniel said, his own voice tight. He supported the woman, who swayed on her feet. "She's hurt bad, Pa." Owen's gaze swept over the woman, taking in her buckskin dress, her dark hair, her exhausted, dirt-streaked face. His expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. He saw not a person in need of help, but a problem, trouble, an intrusion from a world he wanted no part of. "This is our home, not a mission for strays," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "She would have died," Nathaniel countered, a raw edge of defiance in his tone he had not used with his father in years. "I wasn't going to leave her." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other over the fragile body of the woman between them. It was a standoff between the rigid, fearful grief of the father and the burgeoning, uncertain compassion of the son. The silence of the house stretched to encompass them, heavy and fraught with unspoken history. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like the collapse of something old and tired, Owen stepped back from the doorway. "Bring her in," he said, the words grudging and clipped. "But any trouble she brings, it's on your head." Nathaniel carried her inside, the warmth and smell of the house wood smoke and old memory enveloping them. He laid her gently on the cot in the small spare room, a room that had not been used since his mother was alive. As he lit a lamp, the soft light fell across her face, and her eyes opened again. They were filled with pain, but also with a quiet, guarded dignity. "Winona," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was the first word she had spoken to him. "Nathaniel," he replied, the name feeling strange on his own tongue. He left a glass of water by the cot and went to the main room. His father was staring into the cold fireplace, his back rigid. Neither of them spoke, but the silence in the house had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of a stranger, a witness to their grief, and the quiet, simmering tension of a choice that could undo them all. Just as Owen had predicted, trouble was not far behind. It arrived not on horseback, but on the wind, carried as a whisper that grew into a rumor. A prospector passing through the high country must have seen Nathaniel's tracks leading away from the ravine, must have seen the signs of a second person. In a small, isolated town like Prescott, a mystery was a spark on dry tinder. The talk started in the saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and ingrained prejudice, an Indian woman, missing from her people, found on Vance land. Speculation festered, turning her from a victim into a threat. Was she a scout for a raiding party? A thief? The very presence of an outsider, especially a native one, unsettled the fragile peace of the frontier community. Meanwhile, on the ranch, a tentative rhythm established itself. Winona's recovery was slow. Her leg was badly sprained, and she had a fever that came and went, leaving her weak and slick with sweat. Nathaniel became her reluctant nurse. He learned to reset her dislocated shoulder with a grim, practiced efficiency that shocked him, following her gasped instructions in a mixture of Lakota and broken English. He brought her broth, which she drank with quiet gratitude, and changed the cool cloths on her forehead. He did this all under the heavy, disapproving gaze of his father. Owen circled the situation like a wary wolf. He never spoke to Winona directly, referring to her only as the woman. Yet Nathaniel saw him watching. He saw him notice the way she kept her small space immaculately tidy despite her injuries, the way she mended the tear in her dress with thread she had painstakingly pulled from a discarded burlap sack, her stitches small and perfect. One afternoon, Nathaniel came into the main room to find his father standing by the open door of the spare room, just looking. Winona was asleep, her face peaceful in the afternoon light. Owen's expression was unreadable, a complicated mask of suspicion and something else, something deeper that Nathaniel couldn't name. As Winona grew stronger, the silence between her and Nathaniel began to fill with small, hesitant sounds. She taught him the Lakota word for water, Nyand. He taught her the name for the bread. He clumsily baked a task his mother had always performed with such effortless grace. He found that her English was better than she had initially let on, her early reticence born of caution, not inability. She told him, in spare, carefully chosen words, that she had been separated from her family during a sudden rockslide while traveling through the mountains. She did not speak of where they were going or from where they had come. Her past remained a closed book, and he did not press. He understood the need for guarded secrets. He had plenty of his own. One evening, a fierce autumn storm blew in, imprisoning them in the house. The wind shrieked around the eaves like a lost soul, and rain lashed against the windows. The fire in the hearth crackled, a lone bastion of warmth against the tempest outside. Owen sat in his chair, sharpening a knife with rhythmic, grating strokes. Nathaniel was reading, and Winona was polishing a tarnished silver locket she wore around her neck. "My mother," she said softly, holding it out for him to see. "8. She pointed at the locket, then tapped her chest. "My 8 gave it to her. Father." Nathaniel looked at the small, oval object. It was worn smooth with time and touch. He thought of his own mother's wedding band, which now sat in a small wooden box on his father's nightstand, untouched. "She was a good woman," Nathaniel found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "My mother, she liked storms." Across the room, the sound of the whetstone paused. Owen's head was bent, his face in shadow, but Nathaniel knew he was listening. Winona nodded slowly, her dark eyes filled with a profound understanding that transcended language. "A strong heart," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. She had seen the ghost of Martha Vance in the way the house was kept, in the carefully tended geraniums still blooming on the windowsill, in the son who could not speak of his mother without his voice cracking. In that moment, the space between them shrank. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim, but two people who understood the shape of loss. The storm passed, but it had shifted something inside the house. The quiet was less tense, more contemplative, but the world outside had not forgotten them. The trouble, when it finally arrived in person, had a name: McBride. He was a local cattleman with a florid face and an oversized sense of his own importance, a man who saw the world in simple terms of property, power, and prejudice. He rode up to the Vance ranch one afternoon with the town sheriff, a man named Hale, whose authority seemed to be on loan from McBride himself. Owen and Nathaniel met them on the porch. Nathaniel's heart began a low, steady drumming against his ribs. "Vance," McBride said, not bothering with pleasantries. He remained on his horse, looking down at them. "Heard a rumor you're harboring a squaw." The slur hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Nathaniel felt a hot flash of anger. Beside him, Owen stiffened. "We have a guest," Owen said, his voice level and cold. "A woman who was injured. It's a private matter." "Not when it concerns the safety of this community," McBride retorted, his voice rising. "There's been livestock go missing over at the Sinclair place. People are nervous. An Indian woman shows up out of nowhere. It doesn't look good. We think it's best if she comes with us back to town for questioning." Sheriff Hale shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Just to sort things out, Owen. No trouble." Nathaniel knew what questioning meant. It meant a locked cell, intimidation, and judgment passed long before any facts were known. He saw Winona's face in his mind, a quiet dignity, her pain, the trust she had begun to place in him. "She's not going anywhere," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "She's still recovering. She's done nothing wrong." McBride's eyes narrowed, focusing on Nathaniel as if seeing him for the first time. He gave a short, derisive laugh. "The boy's got a soft spot, it seems. Listen, Vance, you can do this the easy way, or you can find yourself on the wrong side of your neighbors. This ain't a request." The threat was clear. Ostracism, economic pressure, maybe worse. Nathaniel looked at his father. Owen's face was a granite mask, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. For a terrible moment, Nathaniel thought he would yield. His father was a practical man, a man who believed in weathering storms by bending, not breaking. To risk everything for a stranger, it went against his very nature. "The boy is right," Owen said, his voice quiet but as solid as the foundation of the house. "The woman is under our roof, under our protection. She stays. Now, unless you have a warrant, you're on private property. I suggest you leave." A flicker of shock, then grudging respect, passed through Sheriff Hale's eyes. McBride's face flushed a deep, angry red. He looked from Owen's unyielding stance to Nathaniel's defiant one. He had expected a quick and easy resolution, an affirmation of his own power. He had not expected this united front. "This isn't over, Vance," McBride snarled, yanking on his horse's reins. "You'll regret this, both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, the sheriff following in his wake like a reluctant shadow. They left behind a silence charged with the promise of future conflict. Nathaniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked at his father, a question in his eyes. Owen didn't look at him. He just stared out at the trail where the riders had disappeared. "Go check on her," he said, his voice rough. "Make sure she didn't hear." But as Nathaniel turned to go inside, he knew Winona had heard every word, and he knew that the line had been drawn. The Vance Ranch was no longer just a place of mourning, it had become a sanctuary. And its defense rested on the shoulders of a grieving father and his son who had, in the space of a single afternoon, finally found a cause to stand for together. The days that followed were thick with a tension that felt like the heavy, charged air before a lightning strike. The Vances were now marked men. A trip into Prescott for supplies became an exercise in silent hostility. Faces turned away. Conversation ceased when Nathaniel entered the general store. The proprietor, a man who had known him since he was a boy, served him with a cold formality, his eyes refusing to meet Nathaniel's. The isolation they had cultivated in their grief was now being forced upon them by their community. They were pariahs. Back at the ranch, the unspoken alliance between the three of them solidified. Winona, now able to walk with only a slight limp, insisted on contributing. She took over the mending, her fingers nimble and sure. She showed Nathaniel how to find edible roots along the creek bed, knowledge that felt ancient and vital. She even began to tend to Martha's neglected geraniums, her gentle touch seeming to coax them back to a more vibrant life. She moved through their home with a quiet grace that did not try to fill the void Martha had left, but rather created its own unique space. One evening, Nathaniel found his father sitting on the porch, watching Winona as she scattered feed for the chickens. She moved with an economy of motion, a peaceful rhythm that seemed to calm the frantic birds. Owen was holding his wife's small gardening trowel, turning it over and over in his work-roughened hands. "Your mother," Owen said, his voice low and raspy. "She loved this time of day," said the light was honest. It was the most he had spoken of her in months. Nathaniel sat down on the steps, not wanting to break the fragile spell. "She would have liked Winona," Nathaniel said quietly. Owen did not reply. He simply continued to watch as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the yard, illuminating the woman who had brought such turmoil and, paradoxically, such a strange, burgeoning peace to their lives. He was seeing more than just an outsider now. He was seeing a woman of quiet strength and deep resilience, qualities he had loved so fiercely in his own wife. The prejudice that had armored his heart was beginning to crack. The final confrontation came without warning. It was just after dusk, a time of deep shadows and uncertain light. A dog began to bark frantically from a neighboring ranch, a sound of alarm that carried clearly on the still night air. Nathaniel felt a cold premonition. He went to the window and peered out into the gathering dark. He saw them, a small group of riders, maybe 5 or 6, cresting the low ridge to the east. They were not moving with the easy gait of travelers. They were riding with purpose, dark shapes against a darkening sky. "Pa," he said, his voice tight. "They're coming." Owen was on his feet in an instant. He went to the mantel and took down the Winchester rifle that had hung there for years. His movements were calm and deliberate, betraying none of the turmoil Nathaniel felt churning in his own gut. He handed a smaller shotgun to Nathaniel. "Stay inside," Owen said, his voice a low command. He glanced towards the spare room where Winona had retreated at the first sound of the dogs. "Both of you." But Nathaniel shook his head. "I'm standing with you." The look that passed between them was one of complete, unspoken understanding. This was not just about protecting Winona anymore. It was about defending their home, their integrity, the very ground where their family was buried. It was about refusing to let fear and hatred dictate their lives. Owen gave a single, sharp nod. They stepped out onto the porch together as the riders entered the yard. McBride was at their head, his face flushed with whiskey and self-righteous fury. The men with him were a mix of ranch hands and town loafers, their expressions ranging from sullen to eager. They were a mob, stripped of reason and fueled by a collective, ugly certainty. "Vance," McBride bellowed, his voice slurring slightly. "We gave you a chance. We're done talking. Send out the squaw." "You're not welcome here, McBride," Owen said, his voice carrying with surprising force in the twilight. The Winchester rested easily in the crook of his arm, its long barrel glinting in the last of the light. "Turn around and ride out." "We're not leaving without her," one of the other men shouted. "This is decent, white territory." The mob grew bolder, fanning out, their intentions clear. They were going to storm the house. Nathaniel's hands were slick with sweat on the stock of his shotgun. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was terrified, but a strange clarity settled over him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not let them pass. He would not let them lay a hand on the woman who had, in her quiet way, begun to stitch their broken family back together. He raised the shotgun, the metallic click of the hammer being pulled back, echoing loudly in the tense silence. "You take one more step," he warned, his voice shaking but firm, "and I swear to God I will shoot." McBride laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Look at the boy, playing soldier. You ain't got the nerve." He started to dismount, his eyes fixed on the front door, as if he could already see his prize. And then the door opened. But it was not Winona who stepped out. It was Owen. He moved from the relative safety of the porch and walked down the 3 steps to stand on the ground, placing himself squarely between the riders and his son. He held the Winchester at his side, not aiming it, but holding it with an air of absolute finality. He was no longer a man hiding in his grief. He was the master of this land, a patriarch defending his home. "I will say this only once," Owen said, his voice low and lethal, cutting through the bluster of the mob. "This land is my land. The woman in that house is under my protection. My son stands with me. To get to her, you will have to come through us. I buried my wife on that hill. I will not have her grave dishonored by this kind of ugliness. Not tonight, not ever." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each man, his eyes as hard and cold as winter stone. "Now, weigh the cost," he finished. "Decide if what you came for is worth what you will leave in this yard." The raw, unshakable conviction in his voice hung in the air. The men looked at Owen, then at Nathaniel, then back at Owen. They saw 2 determined men, armed and ready to die on their own land. The drunken bravado began to curdle into uncertainty. This was not the easy victory they had envisioned. They were farmers and ranch hands, not killers. The price Owen had laid out, a price paid in blood and bodies, was too high. One by one, they began to back their horses away, their gazes dropping, avoiding McBride's furious glare. The mob was dissolving, its courage evaporating into the night. McBride, seeing his support vanish, was left sputtering in impotent rage. "Cowards! You're all cowards!" he screamed at their retreating backs. He shot one last venomous look at Owen and Nathaniel. "This ain't forgotten." But his threats were hollow now. He was alone. With a final curse, he wrenched his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing the scene of his humiliation. Silence descended on the yard, thick and profound. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the ragged sound of Nathaniel's own breathing. He slowly lowered the shotgun, his arms trembling from adrenaline. His father stood for a long moment, his back to him, before turning around. Owen walked back up the porch steps. He looked at his son, his face illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the house. The hard mask of grief and anger he had worn for so long had finally crumbled. In its place was a weary sorrow, but also a deep, abiding pride. "Your mother," Owen said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have been proud of you tonight, son, so very proud." Tears welled in Nathaniel's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. The dam of unspoken pain that had stood between them for 6 long months had finally broken. They were not just a father and son bound by blood and a shared name. They were comrades, survivors who had faced down the darkness together and won. The door opened behind them, and Winona stepped out. She had heard everything. Her face was etched with gratitude and a sorrow of her own for the battle they had been forced to fight on her behalf. She looked at Owen, then at Nathaniel, and gave a slow, respectful nod. No words were needed. In the crucible of that confrontation, a new family had been forged, done conventional, unexpected, and unbreakable. The silence that filled the Vance home now was not one of loss, but of quiet strength and earned peace. In the weeks and months that followed the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the Vance ranch. It was not the oppressive, grief-stricken silence of before, but a peaceful, breathing stillness, filled with the small, comfortable sounds of a life being rebuilt. The town of Prescott kept its distance, a community nursing a grudge, but their hostility no longer felt like a threat. It was merely a fact, like the direction of the wind or the hardness of the winter ground. The ranch had become their entire world, an island sanctuary in a sea of judgment. The standoff in the yard had irrevocably altered the dynamic between father and son. The shared danger had acted like a fire, burning away the dross of unspoken resentment and leaving behind a purer, stronger bond. Owen began to talk again, not often, and never for long, but the words were no longer just functional. He would share a memory of the time she'd insisted on planting a rosebush in the rocky soil and how she'd coaxed it into blooming through sheer will. He and Nathaniel started working together again, not just alongside each other. Repairing a collapsed section of a barn roof became a collaboration, their movements synchronized, their conversation easy and practical, punctuated by shared moments of quiet satisfaction. The chasm of their mutual grief had not vanished, but they had finally built a bridge across it. Winona became the heart of their new, quiet life. Her healing was complete, leaving behind only a faint limp that was more pronounced when she was tired, and a web of fine scars on her leg that she bore with uncomplaining dignity. She never spoke of leaving. It was an unspoken understanding that this was her home now, for as long as she chose it. She brought with her a different kind of wisdom, one that was tied to the land in a way the Vances had never understood. She showed them which plants could be used for tea to soothe a cough, how to read the clouds to predict a coming snow with startling accuracy. She and Owen developed a relationship of deep, silent respect. He would watch as she worked, her hands gentle and sure, with the chickens or in the small garden she had started. He saw in her the same resilience and inner strength that had been the bedrock of his own marriage. She, in turn, seemed to understand his enduring sorrow without needing it to be spoken, offering him a companionship that demanded nothing. Her bond with Nathaniel deepened into a tender, unspoken affection. They were two solitary souls who had found a kindred spirit in the wilderness. They would walk along the creek in the evenings, the silence between them comfortable and rich. He would tell her about his mother, about the books she used to read to him, and she would tell him stories of her people, of the stars and the seasons. Her presence was a balm to the raw wound of his loss. He had found her, a woman pinned and broken, but in saving her, he had begun the long, arduous process of saving himself. She was not a replacement for the mother he had lost, but she had become a mothering force in his life, a source of healing and gentle guidance that had nurtured both him and his father back towards the light. One crisp afternoon in late spring, nearly a year after her arrival, the three of them worked together to plant a small apple sapling on the hill, not far from Martha's grave. Owen dug the hole, his movements steady and strong. Nathaniel lowered the young tree into the earth, and Winona carefully packed the soil around its fragile roots. They worked in a seamless, practiced harmony. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their work. The sapling was a thin, hopeful whip against the vast blue sky. It was a promise of future seasons, of growth, of life continuing. Owen looked from the sapling to his wife's simple wooden cross, then at his son, and finally at the quiet woman who stood beside him. A rare, gentle smile touched his lips. "She would have liked this," he said, and this time the words held no pain, only a quiet, peaceful acceptance. Nathaniel felt Winona's hand lightly touch his arm, a simple gesture of shared understanding. He looked at the home his mother had built, the home they had almost lost, and the improbable family that now lived within it. The grief for his mother was still there, a soft ache in his heart, but it was no longer a desolate emptiness. It was a space filled with love and memory, a foundation upon which they had built something new. He had been a son lost in sorrow, but in finding a stranger in a ravine, he had found a path back to his father and back to himself. The house was no longer silent, it was quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time in a very long time, there was the unmistakable sound of hope. The year was 1887, and the silence of the high plains was the only companion Arthur Vance had permitted himself for a long time. It was a silence with weight, pressing in on the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, a monument to a life that had ended before it had truly begun. The wind, a constant and mournful presence, scoured the land, stripping it bare in winter and baking it dry in summer. It was a landscape that mirrored the terrain of his own heart, vast, empty, and weathered by a grief so profound it had become a part of his bones. Arthur's days were carved into a routine as rigid and unyielding as the granite outcrops that broke the monotony of the rolling grasslands. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, his first chore to check on the small herd of cattle that represented his sole connection to the world of commerce and men. He mended fences that seemed to perpetually sag under the weight of the wind, chopped wood until his shoulders ached with a satisfying, thought-numbing burn, and cooked meals for one that were purely functional, devoid of pleasure. The world had been stripped of its color and savor the day he had buried his wife, Martha, and their infant son, both taken by a fever that had swept through their lives like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash. He had become a man of few words because there was no one to speak them to. The sound of his own voice, when he was forced to use it on his biannual trips to the town of Redemption, was a foreign, jarring thing. The townspeople saw a grim, solitary figure, a man whose sorrow had hardened him into something unapproachable. They whispered about him, speculating on the tragedy that had hollowed him out, but none dared to breach the wall of quiet he had built around himself. He was a ghost on the edge of their world, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn, and they were content to leave him to his haunting. His stasis was a form of living death. He did not hope for a better tomorrow because he could not conceive of one. He simply endured, moving through the motions of survival, his calloused hands a testament to a life of labor that did little to soothe the unquiet territory of his mind. The past was a phantom that walked beside him, its touch cold on his shoulder in the quiet of the evening, its whispers carried on the same wind that moaned around the eaves of his cabin. He was 40 years old, but he felt ancient, a relic of a happiness so distant it might have belonged to another man entirely. The disruption came on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. The sun was a hot, brassy coin in a cloudless sky, and Arthur was replacing a rotted post on his northern fence line when he saw the movement. It was not the familiar shape of a coyote or an antelope. It was small, hunched, and struggling through the tall grass. He squinted, his hand shielding his eyes, and a knot of irritation tightened in his gut. A stray dog, most likely. Another mouth to feed or a creature to put out of its misery. He picked up his rifle, not out of malice, but from a lifetime of practicality. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a child, a girl, with a tangle of dark hair and a dress that was little more than a collection of faded rags. She stumbled, fell, and pushed herself back up with a determination that was painful to watch. She was heading for the small creek that cut through his property, her movements frantic, desperate. He saw her glance back over her shoulder, her face a pale smudge of terror, and he lowered the rifle. This was not a stray dog. This was trouble of a kind he had not encountered in years. He watched her reach the creek and fall to her knees, scooping water into her mouth with trembling, cupped hands. She drank like a wild thing, deep and fast, until she choked, collapsing onto the bank in a fit of coughing. Arthur remained where he was, a statue carved from dust and reluctance. His first instinct was to turn around, to walk back to his fence post and pretend he had seen nothing. His life was his own, his grief a private, sacred thing. He had no room for the complications of others. But he did not move. He saw the thinness of her arms, the sharp angle of her shoulder blades through the torn fabric of her dress. He saw the way she huddled into herself, even in the heat, as if trying to disappear. And then he heard the distant sound of a wagon and a man's voice, sharp and angry, calling a name he couldn't quite make out. The girl's head shot up. Panic seized her small frame. She scrambled to her feet and looked around wildly, her eyes like those of a cornered rabbit. They landed on Arthur. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the 50 yards of sun-bleached grass that separated them. He could feel the weight of her desperation, a palpable force that reached out and took hold of him. She ran, not away but towards him. It was the last thing he expected. She ran with a stumbling, frantic gait, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She did not stop until she was almost upon him, collapsing at his dusty boots. She was shaking, her small body racked with a terror so absolute it made his own hardened heart ache with a strange, forgotten sympathy. "Please," she gasped, her voice thin and reedy, choked with tears and dust. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her blue eyes wide and swimming with a plea that was almost a physical blow. "Please, mister." Arthur said nothing. He simply looked down at the child, his mind a turmoil of resistance and a nascent, unwelcome sense of responsibility. The wagon sounds were closer now. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her fingers clutching at the rough denim of his trousers. "He's going to sell me to the mining camp." The words came out in a rush, a torrent of fear. "Please, you have to help me. Just for a little while, just pretend." He frowned, the words not quite making sense. Pretend what? His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. The girl pushed herself up onto her knees, her gaze locked on his. The hope in her eyes was a fragile, flickering candle against the vast darkness of her fear. "Pretend to be my father," she begged, the words a raw, desperate prayer. "Please, pretend to be my father, so they don't sell me." Arthur's world, so carefully constructed of silence and routine, fractured. The wind seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, the wagon crested the low rise, a dark shape against the brilliant blue of the sky. He had a choice. He could send her away, back to whatever fate awaited her, and reclaim his hard-won peace. Or he could step into a lie, into a complication so profound it would change everything. He looked down at the small, trembling girl at his feet and saw in her eyes the reflection of every loss he had ever known. "Get in the cabin," he said, his voice a low growl, "and don't make a sound." The girl, whose name he would later learn was Cora, scrambled to her feet and fled towards the dark rectangle of the cabin door without a second glance. Arthur turned to face the approaching wagon, the weight of his old rifle suddenly feeling heavier in his hand. He was no longer just a man mending a fence. He was, for this moment, a father. The lie settled over him like an ill-fitting coat, awkward and strange, but also, inexplicably, a shield. The wagon that rolled to a stop a few yards from him was a shabby, utilitarian vehicle, pulled by a single, tired-looking horse. The man holding the reins was large and florid, with a self-important air that sat poorly on his cheap suit. His name was Mr. Hale, a man who ran the county's affairs concerning its orphans with a ledger book for a heart. He was flanked by a wiry, unshaven man who served as the town's part-time deputy, a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. "Vance," Mr. Hale said, his tone suggesting he was bestowing an honor simply by speaking the name. He did not get down from the wagon. "We're looking for a runaway, a girl, from the county home. Saw her heading this way." Arthur's grip tightened on the stock of his rifle. He kept the barrel pointed at the ground, but his posture was an unmistakable warning. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. The lie felt foreign on his tongue, but it came out steady. The deputy, a man named Shaw, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We tracked her to the creek, Vance. Don't make this difficult. She's county property. A ward of the state." "She ain't property," Arthur said, the words coming from a place deeper than he expected. "And she ain't here." Mr. Hale's face purpled slightly. He was not a man accustomed to being contradicted, especially by a recluse he considered little better than a savage. "Now, see here, I have a contract for that girl, a placement. Mr. Donovan at the Silver Camp is expecting a scullery maid, a good, honest position for a girl with no prospects." Arthur knew of Donovan's camp. He knew the kind of positions available to young girls there. A cold fury, an emotion he had not felt in years, began to smolder in his chest. It was a clean, righteous anger that burned away the fog of his grief for a moment. He thought of the terrified child hiding in his cabin, a place that had only ever known sorrow. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I haven't seen her. Now, you're on my land. I suggest you leave." Mr. Hale puffed out his chest. "I have the authority to search these premises. That girl is a fugitive." Arthur took a slow step forward. He did not raise the rifle, but his intent was clear. "And I have the right to defend my home from trespassers. This is my property. My daughter and I value our privacy." The word hung in the air between them, shimmering in the heat. Daughter. It was a bolder lie than Cora had asked for, a direct claim. Mr. Hale's jaw went slack. Deputy Shaw shifted uncomfortably on the wagon seat. They had all heard the stories of Arthur Vance, the grieving widower, the solitary man. A daughter had never been part of that narrative. "Your daughter?" Hale stammered, his bluster momentarily deflated. "That's preposterous. You have no daughter." "My Martha's girl," Arthur said, the name of his dead wife, a painful, protective invocation. "From before. She's been living with her aunt back east. Just came home to me a few weeks ago. She's shy of strangers." He was building the lie brick by brick, astonished at how readily the words came. Each one was a stone laid on the wall around the child in his house. Hale looked from Arthur's grim face to the unblinking door of the cabin. The story was flimsy, unbelievable. But Arthur Vance's reputation, his known grief, and the rifle he held so casually all conspired to give it a strange, unnerving plausibility. To call him a liar to his face was to invite a confrontation that neither Hale nor his hired deputy seemed eager to pursue. The profit from one orphan girl was not worth the risk. "If I find you're lying, Vance," Hale began, his voice trailing off into an empty threat. "You won't," Arthur said, his tone flat and final. "Now, get off my land." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind and the tired breathing of the horse. Then, with a muttered curse, Mr. Hale yanked on the reins, turning the wagon in a wide, clumsy arc. He shot one last venomous glare at Arthur before snapping the reins, urging the horse into a reluctant trot back the way it had come. Arthur watched until the wagon was just a small, dark speck receding into the vastness of the prairie. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. The tension drained out of him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely shaky. He had stared down the world and won, but the victory felt precarious. He turned and walked back to the cabin, the lie he had told echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was dim after the brightness outside. Cora was huddled in the far corner, beside the cold stone hearth, making herself as small as possible. She looked up at him, her eyes enormous in the gloom. The fear had not left them, but it was now mingled with a fragile, questioning hope. For a long time neither of them spoke. The space between them was filled with the enormity of what had just happened. He had lied for her. He had claimed her. He had stood between her and the men who would have taken her. He felt her gaze on him, studying him, trying to understand the man who had just named himself her father. "They gone?" she whispered. "For now," he said, his voice still gruff. He walked over to the stove and began to methodically build a fire, his movements a return to the familiar comfort of routine. He did not look at her. He felt a need to put distance between them again, to re-establish the boundaries that her desperation had shattered. "You can stay the night. We'll figure out what to do with you in the morning." He expected a flood of thanks, or perhaps more tears. Instead, there was only silence. He glanced over his shoulder. She hadn't moved from her spot on the floor. She was just watching him, her expression unreadable. She had the stillness of an animal that has learned through bitter experience that safety is fleeting. The first few days were a study in guarded observation. Cora moved through his small cabin like a ghost, a silent, watchful presence. She ate the plain food he set before her without complaint, her eyes darting towards him with every scrape of his fork on the tin plate. She slept on a pallet of blankets he'd laid out by the hearth, curling into a tight ball as if to ward off the world. He learned that she was 10 years old, that her parents had died of influenza the previous winter, and that the county home Mr. Hale ran was less a sanctuary and more a holding pen for cheap labor. Arthur, for his part, tried to maintain the fiction of his solitude. He went about his chores with a grim determination, pretending the small shadow that sometimes trailed him at a distance did not exist. He found himself leaving a bucket of water and a bar of lye soap on the porch for her, telling himself it was a matter of hygiene, not kindness. He left a plate of biscuits on the table before he went out, a silent offering he refused to acknowledge. He was a man adrift, caught in a current he had not chosen, and he fought against it with every fiber of his being. Their conversations were sparse, functional exchanges. "Wood box is low. I can get it. It's too heavy. No, it ain't." And he would watch from the corner of his eye as she struggled with logs almost as big as her own thin legs, her jaw set with a stubborn pride that pricked at his conscience. She did not ask for anything. She tried to make herself useful, sweeping the floor with a worn-out broom, her small form lost in the simple domestic act. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that turned the sky into a churning cauldron of black and grey. Lightning spider-webbed across the heavens, and thunder cracked like the sky itself was breaking apart. Arthur was used to it. The noise was just another part of the land's harsh symphony. He was reading an old almanac by the light of a kerosene lamp when a small sound from across the room broke his concentration. It was a whimper. He looked over to the hearth. Cora was sitting bolt upright on her pallet, her blanket clutched to her chin. In the flickering lamplight, he could see that her face was pale and her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with Mr. Hale. Another crash of thunder shook the cabin, and she flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips. His first instinct was to ignore it. She was not his responsibility. Her fears were not his to soothe. He had sealed his heart against such things. But then a flash of lightning illuminated her face, and he saw the tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. He saw not just a runaway orphan, but a child, small and terrified and utterly alone in the dark. The memory of another small face, his own son's, flickered in his mind, a sharp, unexpected pang of loss. With a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, he put down the almanac. He stood up and walked over to her. He did not know what to do, what to say. The language of comfort was one he had long forgotten. He stood over her awkwardly for a moment, a large, looming shape in the dim light. "It's just thunder," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She shook her head, not looking at him. "It sounds like when the roof fell in," she whispered, her voice trembling. "After Papa," she trailed off, a sob catching in her throat. Understanding dawned on him. Her fear was not of the storm, but of the memory it invoked. It was a grief that echoed his own. He looked at her huddled form, and the wall around his heart developed another crack. He sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, but simply closing the distance. It was a gesture of solidarity he had not offered another human being in years. "My Martha," he said, the name feeling strange and sacred on his lips. She was scared of lightning, said it was God clearing his throat. I told her he must have a powerful lot to say about this part of the country. Cora looked up at him then, her tear-filled eyes wide with surprise. It was the first time he had volunteered a piece of himself, a piece of his past. The corner of her mouth twitched, a shadow of a smile. "Is that what you think?" "No," he said, looking towards the small window where the rain lashed against the glass. "I think it's just weather, and weather passes." They sat there in silence for a long time as the storm raged outside. He did not offer any more words of comfort, and she did not seem to need them. His presence beside her was enough. Gradually, her trembling subsided. Her breathing evened out. When the thunder had softened to a distant rumble, he looked down and saw that she had fallen asleep, her head slumped against her knees. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he stood up. He looked down at the sleeping child, a fierce, unfamiliar wave of protectiveness washing over him. This was more than a lie to fend off a corrupt official. This was something real, something growing in the barren soil of his life. He picked up his own thick wool blanket from his bed and gently draped it over her. He went back to his chair, but he did not pick up the almanac. He just sat and watched over her until the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. The shared vulnerability of the storm marked a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The silence between them was no longer thick with suspicion, but laced with a tentative, unspoken understanding. Cora began to talk more, not about her past, but about the world around them. She would point out a hawk circling high overhead or the shape of a rabbit in the clouds, small observations that slowly reintroduced color into Arthur's monochrome existence. He found himself responding, teaching her the names of the prairie grasses and the difference between a coyote's track and a wolf's. He showed her how to milk their lone cow, his large, calloused hands guiding her small ones with a surprising gentleness. He discovered she had a quick mind and a resilience that astonished him. She was not broken by what she had endured. She was bent, but determined to stand straight again. One afternoon, he was repairing a leather strap on a saddle when she approached him, holding out a shirt. It was his, one of his 2 work shirts, and it had a long tear in the sleeve. "I can fix it," she said quietly. "My mama taught me to sew." He looked from the shirt to her small, determined face. He was about to refuse, to say it didn't matter, but he stopped himself. He saw the need in her eyes, the need to contribute, to earn her place, to be more than just a burden. "There's a sewing kit in that tin box," he said, gesturing with his head towards a dusty box on a high shelf. "Martha's." He watched as she carefully took the box down and opened it. Inside were spools of thread, a silver thimble, and needles neatly tucked into a velvet cushion. It was a small, intimate piece of the life he had lost, and seeing her small hands moving among those familiar objects sent a pang through him. But it was not just pain anymore. It was a strange mingling of sorrow and a new, quiet warmth. She sat on the porch steps, the large shirt draped over her lap, and began to sew. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of perfect, ordered care on the rough, faded fabric. Arthur went back to his saddle, but he was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft, rhythmic sound of the needle passing through cloth. It was a sound of mending, of repair, and it seemed to apply to more than just the shirt. It was as if she were stitching together the torn fabric of their quiet, broken lives. The piece, however, was a fragile thing. Arthur knew that Mr. Hale was not a man to let a matter drop, especially when his authority had been challenged. The threat of his return was a constant, unspoken shadow on the horizon. The lie they were living was a shelter, but a flimsy one, and Arthur found himself thinking more and more about how to make it stronger. The town of Redemption was a place Arthur avoided, but he knew he could not do so forever. Their supplies were running low, and whispers from town would be the first sign of renewed trouble. One morning, he hitched his horse to the buckboard and told Cora he was going to town. "I want to come," she said immediately, her chin set in that stubborn way he was beginning to recognize. "No," he said, "it's not safe. Someone might recognize you. They'll be more suspicious if you start buying things a girl would need, and you keep saying your daughter is with you," she argued, her logic unassailable. "We have to act like it's true. We have to be seen together." He knew she was right. The lie had to be lived boldly or it would collapse. The thought of taking her into that hive of gossip and judgment filled him with a cold dread, but he could see no other way. "All right," he conceded with a heavy sigh. "But you stay close. You don't talk to anyone unless I say so. Understand?" She nodded, her expression serious. He had her wash her face and braid her tangled hair. He even found one of Martha's old bonnets, a simple calico thing that he hoped would help obscure her face. As she stood by the wagon, looking small and uncertain but resolute, he felt that fierce protectiveness rise in him again. She was his responsibility, she was his lie, and he would defend her. The trip to Redemption was tense. Cora sat silently beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. When they arrived, the town seemed to stop and stare. Arthur Vance, the recluse, was in town. And he had a child with him. He could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity a palpable force. He kept his face a granite mask, lifted Cora down from the buckboard, and took her hand. Her small, thin fingers wrapped around his, a trusting, anchoring weight. He walked directly to the general store, his stride purposeful, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was aware of the murmurs that followed in their wake. Inside the store, Mr. Donovan, the owner, a man with kind eyes and a curious nature, watched them approach. "Arthur," he said, his voice friendly but questioning, "good to see you, and who is this?" "My daughter, Cora," Arthur said, the lie feeling more solid this time, reinforced by the public declaration. "She's staying with me now." Donovan's eyebrows rose, but he was too polite to press. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Cora." He smiled at her. Cora, remembering Arthur's instructions, simply nodded shyly and squeezed his hand tighter. Arthur bought flour, salt, coffee, and beans. Then, his voice feeling thick in his throat, he asked for a length of blue calico fabric and 2 pairs of sturdy shoes, the kind a growing girl would need. As Mr. Donovan measured the fabric, Arthur felt a pair of eyes on him from the back of the store. He turned his head slightly. It was Deputy Shaw, leaning against a barrel, his expression a mixture of suspicion and calculation. He had clearly reported his failure at the ranch to someone other than Hale. A cold knot formed in Arthur's stomach. The threat was not gone. It was here, in this town, watching them. He paid for his goods, his movements deliberate and calm, and led Cora back out into the harsh sunlight. He wanted to leave immediately, to retreat to the safety of his isolated land, but he knew that would look like flight. They had to complete the illusion. His fears were realized as they were loading the buckboard. A voice, slick with false pleasantry, called his name. "Vance, I see you brought your daughter to town." Arthur turned slowly. Mr. Hale was standing on the boardwalk, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was not wearing his cheap suit today. He was dressed more formally, and he was flanked not by the feckless Shaw, but by the town sheriff. A hard-faced man named Prescott, who valued order and the letter of the law above all else. "Sheriff," Arthur said, nodding curtly to the man, ignoring Hale. "We were just heading home." "Hold a moment, Vance," Sheriff Prescott said, his voice even but firm. "Mr. Hale has lodged a formal complaint. He believes this child is a runaway ward of the county, one Cora Miller. He has paperwork." Hale produced a document with a flourish. A legal order of guardianship, signed by the circuit judge himself. "This child belongs in my care until she is of age or placed in a suitable home." Arthur felt Cora tremble beside him. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent message of reassurance, though his own heart was pounding. This was the confrontation he had dreaded. Their flimsy lie was about to be tested by the full weight of the law. "This is my daughter," Arthur repeated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Her name is Cora Vance. Her mother was Martha Vance, my late wife." "A convenient story," Harler sneered. "But one without a shred of proof. You have no birth certificate, no baptismal record. This girl appeared out of nowhere. I have witnesses who tracked her to your property." Sheriff Prescott looked at Arthur, his eyes narrowed. He was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. "Mr. Hale has a point, Vance. The law requires proof. Can you provide any? A letter from this aunt she was supposedly living with. Anything at all?" Arthur's mind went blank. The lie had reached its limit. He had no letters, no proof, nothing but his word against a legal document. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He could see the triumphant glint in Hale's eyes. He had won. He was about to reach for Cora. And then a small voice spoke up from beside him. "I have a letter." Everyone turned to look at Cora. She stepped forward slightly, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a startling courage. She reached into the bodice of her ragged dress and pulled out a small, folded and worn piece of paper. It was a page torn from a Bible, and on it was a faded, spidery script. "It's from my mama," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She held it out not to the sheriff, but to Arthur. "She gave it to me before she died. She told me to find my father. She said his name was Arthur Vance, and he had a ranch near the Redemption Mountains." Arthur took the paper from her small, trembling hand. He stared at it, his mind reeling. On the page, in faint pencil, were just a few words. "He will keep you safe. Find Arthur Vance." He did not recognize the handwriting, but that didn't matter. In that moment, he saw the incredible bravery of this small child, weaving her own lie to bolster his, sacrificing the last tangible piece of her real mother to save herself. She was not just waiting to be rescued, she was fighting alongside him. He looked up from the paper, his gaze meeting Sheriff Prescott's. He held it out. "This is my wife's hand," he said, the lie now infused with a conviction that came from a place deeper than strategy. It came from his heart. "She sent her to me. It took the child a long time to find her way." Sheriff Prescott took the paper and studied it. He looked at Hale's official document, then back at the fragile, heartfelt plea on the Bible page. He looked at Hale's greedy, smug face, and then at Arthur's grim, protective stance, and the child who clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in the world. Prescott was a lawman, but he was also a man who had seen the best and worst of human nature. He saw a predator in a cheap suit, and he saw a broken man who had found something to live for. "A judge's order is a serious thing, Hale," the sheriff said slowly, his voice thoughtful. but it's predicated on the identity of the child. You say she is Cora Miller. Mr. Vance says she is Cora Vance, and has a letter from his deceased wife to that effect. He handed the paper back to Arthur. That's absurd. It proves nothing, Hale sputtered, his face turning red with fury. It casts reasonable doubt, Prescott countered, his tone hardening. This is a matter of parentage, not property. It's a family affair. And until a circuit judge can hear both sides, which won't be for another 3 months, the child stays with the man who claims to be her father. He looked directly at Arthur. But make no mistake, Vance, you will be in that courtroom when the judge arrives, and you had better be able to prove your claim. He turned and walked away, leaving Hale standing on the boardwalk, speechless with rage. The small crowd of onlookers began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. The immediate crisis was over. Arthur felt the tension release in a great, shuddering wave. He looked down at Cora. Her face was pale, but her eyes were shining with a mixture of relief and pride. She had faced the wolf at the door and had not flinched. Without another word, Arthur lifted her into the buckboard, loaded the last of their supplies, and climbed up beside her. He clicked the reins, and the wagon moved forward, leaving the town of Redemption and the sputtering fury of Mr. Hale behind them. They were safe for now, but the clock was ticking. They had 3 months. 3 months to turn a desperate lie into an unbreakable truth. The journey back to the ranch was quiet. The shared danger had forged a new bond between them, stronger than the one built on chores and tentative conversations. They were allies now, co-conspirators in the grand deception of their life together. When they arrived back at the cabin, the simple structure looked more like a fortress than it ever had before, a sanctuary they had successfully defended. That night, after a silent supper, Arthur sat cleaning his rifle while Cora practiced writing her letters on a small piece of slate he had found for her. The name she practiced over and over was Cora Vance. Watching her, Arthur felt a profound shift within himself. The pretense was fading, and a deeper reality was taking root. He was no longer just pretending to be her father. He was becoming him. He was teaching her, protecting her, providing for her. The actions were creating the man. The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. Just over a month later, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It was not the sheriff. Arthur recognized the man as one of the ruthless foremen from Donovan's mining camp. Mr. Hale, it seemed, was not willing to wait for the law. Arthur sent Cora inside and told her to bolt the door. He took his rifle and stood on the porch, waiting. The foreman, a brute named Callahan, rode up with 2 other hard-faced men. They were not here to talk. "Hale's tired of waiting, Vance," Callahan snarled, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "He sold us the girl's indenture. We've come to collect our property." "She's not property," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. "And you're not setting foot on this porch." "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard," Callahan said, dismounting from his horse. His men fanned out, their intentions clear. In that moment, Arthur Vance was not the grieving widower or the lonely recluse. He was a father defending his child. The years of sorrow and isolation fell away, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. "You made your choice when you rode up here," he said. The first shot was not his. It came from the cabin window, a small puff of smoke, followed by the crack of the old squirrel gun he had been teaching Cora to use. The shot was wild, kicking up dust far from any of the men, but its effect was electric. It showed that Arthur was not alone. Callahan, startled, glanced at the cabin, and in that split second of distraction, Arthur fired. His shot was not wild. It struck the pistol out of Callahan's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. Callahan cried out, clutching his stinging fingers. His 2 men, seeing their leader disarmed and their opponent unexpectedly reinforced, hesitated. "The next one won't be a warning," Arthur said, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't possessed in a decade. "Get on your horses. Ride out of here and tell Hale that if he or any man he sends ever comes near my daughter again, I will bury them on this land." There was no bluster in his voice, only the flat certainty of a promise. The two men looked at their foreman, then at the rifle leveled at them, and made their decision. They scrambled back onto their horses. Callahan, cursing and cradling his hand, followed suit. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, not looking back. Arthur stood there until they were gone, his rifle steady in his hands. The adrenaline slowly subsided, and he lowered the weapon. The door behind him creaked open. Cora stood there, the too large squirrel gun clutched in her hands, her face pale but resolute. He turned to her, and for the first time he smiled. It was a real smile, not the grim twitch of the lips he had managed in town, but a genuine expression of pride and relief. "You did good, Cora," he said. "You did real good." She ran to him then, dropping the gun and wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his rough shirt. He stood stiffly for a moment, the embrace so unfamiliar, before his own arms came up and enclosed her in a protective hug. He held her tight, feeling her small shoulders shake, and he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this was his daughter, not by blood, but by choice, not by law, but by love. The denouement was quiet. Sheriff Prescott, hearing of the attempted abduction, rode out to the ranch himself. He saw the evidence of the confrontation and listened to Arthur's terse account. He looked at the man and the child standing together on the porch, a united front, and made a decision. He arrested Mr. Hale for conspiracy and illegal sale of indenture, and the man's corrupt enterprise crumbled. The circuit judge, when he finally arrived, heard the case and, faced with Hale's crimes and the testimony of the sheriff, officially dismissed the county's claim on Cora. He legalized her adoption by Arthur Vance. The lie had become the truth. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. It was no longer a rhythm of solitude, but of companionship. The silence was now filled with Cora's questions, with the sound of her reading aloud in the evenings, with the shared laughter over a misshapen biscuit. Arthur taught her to ride, to track, to understand the subtle language of the land he had once found so desolate. And she, in turn, taught him how to live again. She brought light back into the shadowed corners of his cabin and his heart. One evening they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in the same bruised and beautiful colors that had once only reminded him of his loss. Now, they just looked beautiful. Cora leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of easy affection that was now a part of their daily life. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her. "Miss what?" "Being alone." Arthur considered the question. He thought of the long, silent years, the crushing weight of his grief, the grey, featureless landscape of his existence. He looked at the endless plains stretching out before them, but he no longer saw emptiness. He saw a home. He saw a future. "No," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I didn't know it then, but I was just waiting for you to come home." She smiled, a bright, happy expression that was the most precious thing in his world. The wind still howled across the plains, but it no longer sounded like a thing grieving. It sounded like a song.